Okay, so my name is Jenny Heijun Wills. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm the author of the memoir Older Sister Not Necessarily Related, which came out in 2019. And I'll be doing some readings from the book tonight, and also talking a little bit about mental health and mental wellness within adoptee communities, I guess. So tonight's reading is given in support of the Canadian Mental Health Association. The CMHA provides advocacy programs and resources that help to prevent mental health problems and illnesses. They work to support recovery and resilience, and they enable all people to flourish and thrive. Ride Don't Hide is the CMHA's annual fundraiser through which it raises money for all of their local programming. This includes self-care activities like yoga, daily fitness, outdoor activities, etc. To support these and other programs, please consider donating to CMHA today. Their goal is to reach $70,000, and if 20,000 Manitobans donate $20 each, they'll accomplish more than their goal. So I'm filming from Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is Treaty 1 territory, the traditional and ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Now, there are countless studies by Indigenous people who write about the ways that colonialism, racism, and their effects and expressions contribute to mental health problems and mental illnesses in Indigenous communities. Ongoing abuse at the hand of the state against land and water protectors alone is just one example of how these colonialisms compromise not just physical, but also mental and emotional wellness. The antecedents are not mysterious here. And so when I offer this land acknowledgement, it is done so in this particular context with full awareness of how settler colonialism directly affects the mental health of Indigenous people in disproportionate and unrelenting ways. I also want to offer a content warning because some of the things I'll be discussing tonight, some of the things I'll be reading, in fact, deal with, topics of self-harm, suicide, trauma, and sexual harm. Though indirectly in this text, I'll be discussing these things all within the context of transnational and transracial adoption from South Korea. But these experiences, I think, have echoes elsewhere. So readings from my memoir, Older Sister Not Necessarily Related, which is available through Penguin Random House, through their website, will be complemented with other information. And if folks are interested, we can have like a Q&A at the end, but I won't put anyone on the spot. And also, if people want to ask me questions after the fact, you're free to email me through my website, jennyheijunwills.com, or contact the organizers of these events. I'm sure they can reach out to me if you have any questions. Older Sister is a memoir from 2019 about the past 10 years in my life as a reunited Korean adoptee. Oops, there's someone in the reading room. And in it, I explore these moments of isolation from my racial community growing up, but more specifically, the complexities of coming back together with my first family and meeting and knowing other adopted people. There's sections written in direct address to my older Korean sister, whom I call Unmi. So you'll see her appearing in the work. My return story is unique. So I was adopted in the early 1980s, and I grew up in Southern Ontario in Canada here. And then I made first contact with my Korean mother back in 2008, and then face-to-face contact in 2009. I lived in Seoul for several months while we got to know one another. And during that time, I met 2 other sisters and then one of my other brothers. And the really curious thing about my reunion that I document in this book is that my presence in Korea sort of prompted my Korean parents to reunite after they'd been separated at the hospital when I was born and taken into an orphanage. So they had been apart for 30 years and then reunited and became a couple again. So it's a bit of an unusual story that way. And while it was beautiful in a lot of ways, of course, and as my memoir details, nothing ever can live up to that kind of idealism. Okay, so the first sort of point I want to make is this. In 2013, scholar Kim Mi-suk published a report in which she stated, amongst other things, that nearly 3/4 of the over 1,000 Korean adoptee respondents had experienced what she called an identity crisis in their lifetime. This was on par with the percentage of those surveyed who expressed racism in their adoptive lands, and only slightly higher than the number of adoptees who had already sought mental health treatment. In Minnesota, which is the place where a large number of Korean adoptees end up, but also adoptees from other countries, health records track the annual numbers of Korean adoptee mental illness-related deaths each year. So this is a pressing series of subjects and conversations within our community, and as well as other adoptee communities, I think. So the first reading that I wanted to offer is an introduction to this adoptee guest house that's in Seoul. There are many, but in this particular one, people from all over, adopted people from all over, are coming back to Korea and living together while they try to undergo birth searches at times, cultural returns, etc. Okay. For 4 months, from late August until mid-December, I lived in that guest house for Korean adoptees who'd returned and were staying in Seoul. We ate and drank and slept together, strangers at first, but then quickly not. The speed and force of our fast connections, obvious ignition for the intensity of those relationships. The majority of the adoptees at the guest house were there for a month at most. The owners were kind and the volunteers worked hard. But it was a house of indulgence and discovery, and most times the revelry was too insistent. It was too deliberate. We tried to sanitize our wounds with alcohol, but our injuries are on the inside. Once, a young man who'd been raised in Norway was so drunk he fell down the winding staircase and stayed the rest of the night lying on the hard, unheated floor. The guest house was more or less accessible by all the major metro lines. Tucked in from the road, it featured a rounded front section, glass doors, and a walkout basement. On one wall in the common living area, clocks were set to different time zones, reflecting the locations where many of us had been raised. What was likely offered simply as a practical way to navigate the various and vast distances we had traveled to come home was also a devastating reminder of how disconnected we all were. From each other, from Korea, and maybe also from our adoptive land. If I remember correctly, most of the clocks were labeled after places like Norway and France. I know for certain one clock indicated the time, specifically in Minnesota. I'm not sure why I didn't look out the window the entire time I was there, but if I had, maybe the view would have been of sugar maples green at the moment of my arrival, red a few months in, and bare by the time that I left. For the first 2 weeks of my return, my boyfriend and I stayed on the top floor. We'd known each other for only a year and had spent most of our relationship on the opposite sides of the Canada-US border. So it hardly mattered that we were assigned separate rooms for sleeping. Closeness across space was already familiar. I know I couldn't have made that trip to Korea without him. He held me up. He held me together. He made it safe to come home, and by the time he left, I had a diamond ring on my left hand. A few people like me stayed at the adoptee guest house while they went down the path of reuniting with family. Others were there to search. Many had simply succumbed to the pull of the country we'd all been torn from, were thrown out of years earlier, and had no place to live. I registered the grief of those looking for family when they had to share quarters with us fortunate ones who'd made contact. Many nights I sat with people from Germany, Denmark, the United States, Australia, listening to their sorrow and anger. Some applied for the chance to relay their information on a Korean television program that reconnected long-lost relatives, not just adoptees. I met one woman who was featured on the show. Even after filming her segment and giving over a blood sample to the producers, she never did make contact. I also met a man who'd been rejected by the program. A father himself, he'd left behind his own child in Europe because he was so fixated on finding the parents he'd lost decades earlier. He'd been living without documents in Korea for a long time. We cried together. That Seoul guest house was a place where adoptees came to find kinship and support, where we tried to assemble the shards of lives in a culture that were tossed our way when we became too inconvenient to unsee. But whatever it was that we made of those pieces was indecipherable. So while the guest house was a place where we forged the kinds of connections unavailable in our regular lives, it was also a place of palpable confusion and rage and grief. Someone once described it to me as a space where Korean adoptee loss was concentrated, where one could witness how a decades-long program of international adoption that began in 1953, one that offered some benefits, could also spread devastation across generations of people as it scattered hundreds of thousands of us around the world, where collateral damage collided and drank themselves sick while comparing notes on eerily similar childhoods of food anxiety and abandonment, issues that developed into adult eating disorders and abusive intimate partner relationships, where we competitively offered to reveal our own scars if others showed us theirs first. Those people and their stories settled in my chest, calcified into a heavy mass that rattles in my heart when I think of my months in Seoul. Okay. The authors of the Global Overseas Adoptee Link, or GOALS, text, Adult Adoptees and Mental Health, summarizes the complexities of transnational adoptees, mental wellness, summarizing the ways that the grief and emotional trauma that is at the origin of all adoption is then layered with disrupted and alienated experiences of race, ethnicity, and nationality that manifest differently in youth than in adults, especially in situations of re-immigration and attempts at cultural return. We have no language. We have no way to speak to our people when we find them, if we find them. In other words, it is a life in pieces of distance and dislocation. Even if we're fortunate enough to reunite, we're still in pieces. So the second passage I'd like to read speaks about maybe some of those feelings of disconnect. It's much shorter, I promise. I talk about it every so often. Whisper into the night that I'm tired of feeling hurt and broken, tired of feeling rotten, but I'm afraid of dying. When I was a child, I wished it with every birthday candle on every star. I dreamed in death that I would be reunited with my Korean mother as my Christian nanny had promised. But still today, I'm alive, and so is Umma, and so my wish takes on a different shade. It's not the pain of dying that scares me. It's of being alone, of being untethered to the people I finally found. The Sunday school teachers always said that when people die, they reunite with dead family and friends. Somehow, even without their bodies, people recognize each other, find each other. But how will I find my Korean family in death if even in life we hardly knew each other? What name will we call out in any possible afterworld? Will they even think to look for me, to find me? Or will it be my responsibility again? When I'm on my cloud, how will they hold on to me and me then? There's a piece of comfort and celebration within our community. Sometimes it's finding other Korean adoptees after we've been rejected by other Korean people in our homeland or in the diaspora who don't understand the particularities of our alienations. Sometimes this comes after decades of having never met other people like us. But of course, there's trauma there, and there's pain there, and these things sometimes manifest to duplicate harm within. This next passage is about some of the harms we enact upon each other as Korean adoptees. They come to me, sometimes alone and with secrets whispered only through their eyes. Eyes that tell me everything because we don't need words to speak the things we share between us. They come to me in pairs, groups of 3 or more, bolder to thank me for telling. And then they're telling themselves of that time at the adoptee gathering when girls got together to learn how to paste false eyelashes onto monolids and boys plotted separately how to make the most of the situation. When they schemed, now's their chance, and took what they knew to be their own fears of never being anyone's first choice and made them weapons aimed at the girls distracted by waterproof mascara. They come to me with stories of that time in Seoul, that adoptee from that place. They ask me if the person who cracked me open was American, which makes me think the person who cracked them open was. We talk softly between ourselves, older sisters looking out for the younger ones about to go on roots trips alone. We know that in order to find our pasts, our mothers and fathers and anyone else, we spread ourselves out. We open our hearts and bodies and hope for the best. I want to ask a couple of questions now, or pose a few conundrums for which I don't have the answers, but that I try to work through in the writing of this book. And they basically can be summarized as, what does it mean to be a child physically different from every single person around you? What are the health impacts of those conditions? How does racial confusion live with us always? Here's a passage that I write to my older sister. It's a direct address. On me. Did you know that when I was small, I sometimes hated myself so deeply that I imagined death, but in that dream, my face down 8-year-old body washed up in the weeds of the riverbank, had freckled arms and strawberry blonde hair, straight and thin. When you look at me with your head tilted to the left, your eyes softening as though you pity me, it makes me think that you can sense the sorrow that fills my mouth with stones, stopping me from speaking. and breathing. The last passage that I'll share with you tonight is one that I've never read publicly because it's difficult, more so than the rest. It's about the imperfections of reunion and the damage that can be caused again after the fact. I offer this last reading as comment on what is sometimes the patterns of loss we experience and how these things build. This scene, another comment or conversation to my older sister, describes the day after my wedding in Montreal. My Korean parents traveled to attend the wedding, but I learned around that time that my father was incredibly jealous and controlling of my mother. And the night following our wedding, I confronted him. Now, I had so much, I guess, guilt and confusion around this because also I was only understanding small pieces of what was being told to me because I don't speak Korean and they don't speak English. So I felt guilty because I'd been the sort of catalyst that brought them together, brought him back into her life. But then also I didn't know how to say the things that I was feeling. Okay, so this will be the last thing that I read tonight. Did he tell you about that night in Montreal, Unni? Did he tell you how everything came crashing down and what we'd suspected to be true was, even as we'd hoped it wouldn't be? That there was no putting us back together after all? Did Appa tell you how the apartment walls shook when he yelled at me, how they shook some more when I yelled back? How he was both frightening and not because the undershirt he wore exposed just how big and how old he was at the same time? The way he treated my mother. Did he do the same to yours? Bora, who's my younger sister, told me he was jealous. I saw it with my own eyes at the reception when he scowled at Amma, blaming her each time a man acknowledged her, complimented her hanbok, congratulated her on her daughter's marriage. He couldn't understand them, so he imagined the worst. Was he jealous of your mother also, Unni, the way disloyal people often are? You knew this about him all along, didn't you, Unni? That night in Montreal, when the walls shook, I looked him in the face and with all the rage and sadness of my entire life, once again blamed him for everything. Did you ever show him hate like that? Appa and I, we screamed in different languages. I inferred his accusation that I was a bad daughter. I dug in. I told him I could never be a Korean daughter. Least of all, I could never be his Korean daughter. I told him that it was his fault. I said, look what I've become. Do you think he understood what I said? Did he tell you, Unni, how I ran out into the night? How my husband and Bora came too? That we stayed at a friend's house and how, when we returned the next morning, they were gone. Maybe you asked him how they made it to the airport without money or English or French. Maybe he complained about the cost of changing their tickets to a much earlier flight. Did he tell you that he left a note that Bora translated aloud? It began, I'm not a bad man. She never finished reading it because I'd already fallen to the kitchen floor. All around me was the hair I tore out in fistfuls. From far away, I heard myself screaming in a voice I didn't know. They've left me again. I want to end with a comment on mental wellness and writing, because I think sometimes we see the link between creative expression and health and catharsis. And I noticed that some of the excellent programming that the folks at the CMHA offer are artistic programmings. You know, for me, this is a complicated experience because I feel sometimes, especially when someone is writing about their own life struggles, but also thinking about craft, it does something unique to the ways we think of our own lives and the things we've been through. I will say that I didn't have a cathartic relief writing this book. It wasn't like a kind of counseling or therapy that we sometimes hear about. But I do feel held and seen and cared for when I read it aloud, even to myself. And it's almost like I read myself and my experiences into existence. So that's what I've prepared for everyone tonight. I don't know, I realize that there aren't many people in the chat section of this, but if people have any questions, you're welcome to ask them now. Or like I said, contact me through the folks at the CMHA or through my website. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I will stop the event now, I suppose. Thank you again for bearing with the technical difficulties of this and for agreeing to have this meeting recorded. I hope to see some of you folks face to face once everything is adjusted. Thank you, Michael. Thanks, I see you. All right, thanks everyone. Thanks, Brittany, thanks.